Please welcome Jake, Joel, and Dale to the S4 Main Stage.
So good morning, everybody. I hope you had a good time at the party last night. It's good to see so many of you made it. And if you do see Liz, give her a pat on the back, because a lot of the fun things are her choice, and she does a great job, so we wouldn't be able to do it without her. So this is kind of funny. I read Taleb's books again this year. He's the author of The Black Swan, and my favorite book of his is Anti-Fragile, and they have this concept called Iatrogenics, harm done by the healer, that came from the medical industry, where sometimes doctors were doing things or prescribing medicines or performing procedures that actually caused more harm to the population they were serving than helping them. And the author then looked at that same concept in the financial industry and various other things, and I said, this might be something we should look at in the ICS world. Are we doing things with security controls that may actually be introducing more risk than they are reducing, or causing our systems to be less reliable? So that was the idea, and I said, well, we need to put together a panel on this, and these two guys and myself are all very opinionated, so I know we'd have plenty to argue about, but we also come at these issues with a different point of view, so I thought we would do that. And we're going to start out, we're going to try to cover a couple of different topics. We're going to start out with one that we kind of agree on, which is security patching. So Jake, maybe I'll start with you. From a risk reduction perspective, how do you decide whether security patching is a good security control to implement or a bad security control to implement?
It largely depends on the patch. If this is something like Heartbleed, and it exists in a corner of the network that we don't really use any of those sorts of features in the first place, I'm not patching. If it's not part of the actual work that we're doing. But if it turns out to be something slightly more important, like for example, if there is something that tends to make equipment crash, or that makes equipment susceptible to a crash, I'll think about having people go out there and do the patch. But there has to be a return on the investment, is basically what it comes down to. If there's any downtime, if there's any additional operators that have to be on site, if there's any people that have to run things manually, I'm going to be weighing the cost of those people versus the cost of what happens if this thing here fails.
And Joel, how would you look at that?
Well, for me, the biggest problem I see is inconsistent patching when we try to deploy this in a real operational environment. To kind of categorize a vulnerability, I normally need a vulnerability that actually can transfer into an exploitable vulnerability to get some net risk to operations. But where we start to see this stuff starting to fall apart is they'll do a really good job of patching their Windows operating system infrastructure. But then in that same facility, they have Solaris installations or Juniper firewalls, and they do nothing to patch those. So you sit and go, what you thought was a risk reduction really ended up being net neutral, yet the potential impact to operations was really far greater because, again, you patch in anticipation of preventing something from happening, where an actual process interruption or disruption is really transferable into something negative. So if you try to deploy a patch and it would fail and operations is hurt, you'll probably never be allowed to do patching again.
And then just to throw my 2 cents on this, I always look at, when I'm looking at the criteria for an asset owner, whether they should patch or not, is will applying that patch reduce the risk? So if we're talking about a vulnerable device or application, and this is almost the dense vulnerability concept that we talked with Dan Gear about. If you do not need to exploit that vulnerability to take control of the system, then applying that patch isn't going to do you much good. For example, a PLC that has a cross-site scripting vulnerability in its web server, but you can upload new firmware and new logic without authentication, I'm not sure what I'm really accomplishing in risk reduction by applying the patch. So I think I wanted to start with something where we agreed on. So there are cases where this common security control patching actually could reduce the risk or reliability of your system if you followed the best practice in the enterprise world. And we were all kind of in agreement on that for different reasons. Then we started arguing. So now we get to the ones where we're not all in agreement. And what we're going to start out first with is Active Directory as a deployment, as a set of controls. And let's talk about it first from the computer side. So if you're dealing with HMIs, engineering workstations and such. Joel, where would you come down on that equation, whether that's worth doing?
See, I'm a huge advocate for Active Directory. Again, if we're starting at the computing level, because it offers I think it offers true simplicity in the administration of the infrastructure. You know, you tend to only have to do things once. You can define roles and responsibilities and create schema and structure a single time. And when you start talking about an enterprise, you actually could do it once and then reuse the design as you would deploy it across multiple manufacturing facilities. So it provides a simplicity around engineering and change management, which is a nice benefit. But from a security point of view, I am so much of a proponent of group policy objects and the ability to actually centrally harden an infrastructure, and again, in a very consistent and measurable way versus trying to do it one-off, host by host throughout an architecture, which after a few assets can become very unmanageable.
So in that case, although it requires skills and adds some degree of complexity,
Correct.
The benefits in your mind of the medicine or the cure far outweigh those complications.
Exactly. So one thing I look at is we all had to be trained on the basic systems that we support and administer. So the same should be of new infrastructure and technologies that are becoming commonplace today. I mean, 20 years ago, Active Directory wasn't as common as it is today. And I don't accept as an excuse that it's hard and it's difficult for a control engineer to implement, because that kind of training should be addressed as a core competence for their job.
Okay, and Jake, I know your position is a little more middle of the road on this, but where do you stand on this as an effective security control in the general case?
Scalability is the bottom line. There are lots of smaller places that would not benefit very much from having Active Directory if the whole place only has 3 controllers and half a dozen workstations. You know, it just doesn't make sense in that situation. You would be maintaining almost the same, you'd be adding extra boxes into the picture, and to what end? You know, you're not saving that much. So a lot of systems are like that. But when you scale them up, obviously when you get to a larger plant where you've got, you know, dozens and dozens of people there every day, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. At the lower layers, I would part ways with you.
So yeah, let's morph into that, because we weren't in violent disagreement back in the green room on this. But then when we started talking about your PLCs, your RTUs, your controller type devices, which we're gonna, you know, in the future that's gonna be offered. Where do you stand on that, or how should someone consider making the decision whether this is a good thing to implement?
Controllers, I think, should be kept as simple, dumb, and stupid as possible. That's their goal. You want them to do one thing and one thing only. And they should validate their inputs, but there shouldn't be a whole lot of cryptography going on in a controller. And I'm just not that comfortable with Active Directory and a mother may I approach going on at the controller level. And it gets even worse at the instrument level, assuming you even could propagate that out there, which right now I'm not aware of anything that can do that.
And just to be clear, what's your fear if that's implemented?
It's a failure mode. It's an additional failure mode that can get in your way. And the one thing that we have to avoid is you avoid getting in the way of the guys that hold the big tools. Because if they don't like what they see, they will bypass it, and then your security is a pointless exercise.
But so take Active Directory, right? Active Directory can do a wide range of functions. And one of the key functions most people are familiar with is authentication. Mm-hmm. The whole IAM infrastructure within Active Directory. Don't you believe that controllers are going to have to start authenticating against servers and services?
Higher end controllers will. However, there will always be a case for lower end controllers that just don't need a whole lot. Sometimes you need something you can embed in a machine, for example, and let it just do something automatically. And it exists as its own little zone, and frankly, if you need to do anything to it at all, there's a little tiny front panel that has 3 buttons on it. It's always 3 buttons. And you have to go through a few menus with that. But generally, it isn't that necessary. Now, as the controllers get larger, clearly you're going to have to start working within the higher parts of the infrastructure. Clearly then you have to start thinking, especially things where there's multiple users and it's doing more critical things, not safety things. Safety should live all by itself.
But we already agreed that small systems, Active Directory is probably not practical. But now let's go medium and large. Don't you think that Active Directory is going to be more and more mandatory?
Large, yes. Medium, that depends.
Okay.
When you're talking medium and large, are you talking about this from the standpoint of number of systems or type of devices? Like
Process
very
complexity.
small.
I tend to, if it's done the way I would do it, which is obviously not how Joel would do it. If it's done that way, I would actually look for controllers that follow the process. And if the process is big and complicated and has lots of moving parts, then I would look to Active Directory, especially if there's anything dangerous going on. But if there isn't, then I would be a little bit more relaxed about it.
Okay. So what do you see from your standpoint? You would want to get some major benefits, right, to add this complexity to your network.
Agree.
So what would you see as the major benefits that the owner-operator should look to get before he says, okay, this is worth this medicine?
So what happens is you get into a lot of these discussions, and the one thing that people tend to want to throw out a lot is this idea that the system is constantly changing. I would hope that today, once a plant is commissioned and stable, it's not constantly changing. It is occasionally changing. And the idea is once you have stability and steady state, again, I come from process, and I know you have some semi-process, but the idea is that there was very little change that occurred in that architecture. It's not like we were changing controller configurations hourly. It may be monthly. So the one thing Active Directory provides is once the architecture is stabilized, it becomes auditable and manageable in a consistent fashion. And that's really, I think that security has greater value in consistency, because even if it's wrong and consistent, you would be able to adjust a consistent process and fix it and then continue down the path of consistency again.
My issue is that a lot of times, this is also an issue of management. When people build projects, one of the things we were able to do by having a control systems engineering department in the company was we were able to take the essential things that we wanted the process to do, and we start there. Once you've done the essential things in a process, then the operators can ask for the nice-to-have features. So in my personal experience, 1 to 2 month change timeframes didn't work. We had changes probably about every 2 weeks on average.
All the time?
All the time.
And you implemented it against a change management procedure?
We don't have a change management procedure. What they used to do was they would try it on a parallel part of the process, because a lot of these processes are massively parallel. They would experiment with it, tweak it, get it right, and then distribute it to the other parts of the parallel process. And that would occur over periods of about a month to 2 months. And this would be like, for example, improved backwashing processes, improved filtration processes, things of that sort. Some of these things are just adjustments of set points and timers, but a lot of these things are actual changes in code.
So this is good, because what I'm hearing here is, so we talked about size of the network, number of devices, perhaps the complexity of the devices, and then maybe the stability of the system. So when you're trying to decide whether this control or this medicine or procedure is good for you, if you're talking about something that rarely changes, maybe that's something where there's more benefit than if you're changing it every day, every week, or something like that.
Yeah, I think it has to do with how frequently the system changes. And also, you have to recognize that some of the plants where I worked, I don't think I ever saw them in 30 years without a construction trailer somewhere. So there was always construction going on in some part of every single plant that there was. And in the process of doing that, you've also got concerns about security. You also have concerns about new controllers showing up and concerns about program changes to incorporate everything else that's going on out there. So, you know, you try and implement security in a dynamic environment like that. It's not that straightforward.
Okay, let's shift to another topic because I want to hit two more here quickly. And this one was very interesting. It was the concept of zoning. And so everyone agrees that zones, certain zones from a security standpoint, security zones make sense, like putting your safety system in its own zone, having your control system in a different zone than your corporate network. Those are easy. But then there's the concept of what is the benefit of getting to more granular zones based on different types of things, you know, geography, type of systems and such. And Joel, why don't you start with this, because you're a real proponent of zoning.
Right, so just so that everybody knows, we're talking zones in the context of IEC 62443. And the whole idea behind establishing security zones and the interconnection between the zones or conduits. The idea here is that it is very challenging today, and the documentation's been out for several years, is to get people to move away from a Purdue model type construct where people are trying to align subnets and hierarchies between levels 0 through 4 and try to put that into the context of a zone. When I think of zones, I think of the ability to actually create logical partitions around groupings of assets that share a similar security and risk profile. So for instance, our identification and authentication mechanisms, that really is a very unique infrastructure. It represents enormous value to an adversary because of the ability to extract and harvest credentials. And it typically provides the ability, once compromised, to provide pretty widespread coverage across the rest of the architecture. So for that reason, I'm a huge proponent in trying to create these sub-zones, or really zones within a physical architecture, and then deploy controls that are specific to the zone type. So what you would do for an engineering station is very different than what you would do for an operational station. So this concept of shared logins, because in the business world or the process world that I came from, you could never stand to support a Windows log on, log off. So typically you did an application log on, log off. But what this allowed us to do is to create a profile for an operational workstation and then create a completely separate zone-based policy for that engineering workstation. And the idea here was that the value and the target attractiveness of that engineering workstation is very high. Therefore, the defenses that you deploy should be very different to the operational workstation that needs 100% availability or near thereof. 24/7 manned operation, where the engineering environment typically is a 40-hour week, 5 days per week type situation.
And now I know you're a little more cautious on the amount of zones deployed.
Part of the reason is because we have difficulty on plants of defining who does what. And you don't want to restrict people too much because then the security system gets in the way. So sometimes the engineer needs to holler at the operator on the handheld radio to please go do something on some particular workstation on the other side of the plant because he can see what's going to happen. I like to keep zones at practical process-oriented levels and sometimes at geographic levels, but it doesn't always pay off. A lot of times when the amount of information that has to move between zones gets really high, it becomes impractical. So you really have to start thinking about what information can you, basically where can you build a good fence between something, is what it comes down to. Because if you have to start moving too much information across a zone, then you have to ask why you're building different zones in those different places. So I tend to build larger zones than perhaps Joel might. However, I am generally in agreement that things such as the engineering workstation should be its own zone for security purposes, as should be the tag server and the HMIs and all the other bits and pieces. They all deserve different zones.
So the one thing, though, that you're kind of confusing me on is this concept of a lot of information. Is it a lot of the same information, like a typical real-time data stream, which means I need a big pipe, or is it a lot of small, different, very disparate types of data streams where you need several smaller pipes to do that communication?
Take for example, a plant where you have filters in a water treatment plant. You've got 32 of them, 16 on each side, the east and a west side. You've got 2 backwash systems and 2 other systems that are in there. So what you have are a series of pipes that go to east and west and can be moved back and forth. And you've got communications and interlocks between all the filters so that when one backwashes, the other ones know that they can't. And that means you've got a lot of information that has to be transferred on state in between different filters and the backwash system. The backwash system is in use, or the backwash system is not in use. Or, if you want to get even more granular, is the backwash pump running versus is the blower running for the aeration? So there's all kinds of different things that you can base it on. And it gets really difficult trying to divide them up, especially when you've got a lot of peer-to-peer communications that has to take place between controllers and to a good degree also between HMIs.
Well, so let's move up from the controller level, because I got one more concern. So the whole reason that I approach zoning this way is to prevent a single attack, a successful breach, from providing opportunity to move laterally.
Sure.
So if you have one big zone, how do you contain an attack from impacting 2 or 3 assets to impacting 20 or 30? I mean, the whole idea behind zoning
That's the trade-off you have. Yeah, right. That's the trade-off you have to take into account. What would happen if somebody did these things? And that varies from process to process. So you have to study each process very carefully, find out where the parallel parts are, and if the parallel parts require lots of coordination in between them, then maybe building a zone for the 2 parallel pieces doesn't make sense. But then again, maybe it does. It depends on exactly how much information needs to go, and for that matter, how much opportunity there is to pollute each other.
Yeah, I think if we, that term "a lot," which you were questioning, Joel, I think the key parameters there are, what sort of ports do you have to allow? So what types of communications do you have to allow? Basically any TCP port through or any UDP port through? Well, then separating in a zone doesn't matter. And so the quantity of that type of is more important than the quantity of actual data, the data going back and forth. You don't care whether it's a lot of data or a little data. You care what is possible to get from here to there. And then the other thing to look at is maybe, is what you have to allow through between the zones what the attacker would want? So even if it's only one port, if it's the port that allows you to do whatever you want to the process, splitting them into zones doesn't do much for you. But those, so it's not that zoning is good or bad, and you can go overboard on zone. I'm sure you've probably seen people that have gone to a security class or read a book, who have every single computer in its own zone. And there are some people that recommend that, but you have to look at whether that's actually making your system better or increasing the amount of failure modes. Now, the last area that we talked about is a little bit related to this. It's the concept of roles. And, again, I don't think anyone would argue that role-based access control is good, but then you start to say how many roles are useful and what do you have to commit to make role-based access control successful? And Jake, why don't you start with this one?
Again, I like keeping it comprehensible and stupid because that's what you feel like at 2 o'clock in the morning. When you run a continuous process that has to be online 24 hours a day, you have to keep it simple. So if you're doing role-based access, there's operator, there's engineer, there's administrator for bringing the system up and down, and then there's possibly view only if you have such people on your plant. I would recommend keeping those people to a minimum.
So small number,
very few, very few.
Not so much. How about in a large system? Would you have them area-based, or do you allow anyone to do in the engineer role to do anything in the plant?
That depends on how mobile your operators are expected to be. If your operators are expected to be mobile and get around and do lots of things and be jacks of all trades, then it's really hard to do anything other than a single operator role. But if you've got people who, oh, you didn't get training on this part of the process, then maybe you shouldn't be here. That's a different critter, and I would heartily agree that you probably need separate roles for that.
And you're a little more aggressive on the role
Yes, yeah,
side.
this is kind of funny because this is actually a little bit tricky because, of course, you know the only way that we really can do this is if we have an Active Directory infrastructure. So we kind of win on Active Directory. So to me, I actually believe, and again, it's all from the upbringing that you've gone through, is that I believe that if we're going to improve security with roles, we need to be careful to watch overlapping of rules that allow good and bad with the same role. For instance, there are those that would recommend one role would be used for the creation of assets, creation of user accounts, and there would be a separate role that would be associated with the deletion of those attributes. So I do prefer to have a little bit more granularity because, again, I think it's all the bias of the system that you're most comfortable with. Is that I'm a DCS guy, as many of you know. In the DCS, the role of the engineer actually was a little bit bigger than just an engineer. Typically, you had somebody responsible for controller configuration, and then we had people an entirely separate group that were responsible for graphics. It was a very different skill set and very specialized. So we actually had different roles for those people that were authorized to do graphic modifications versus controller modifications. And then we also had a pretty big separation between engineering tasks or functions and maintenance tasks and functions. So again, the maintenance staff tends to be the hourly organizations, would be responsible for bringing systems up, or if we were doing turnarounds and shutdowns, things like that, they would be responsible for bringing the systems down, which was a very separate task from the engineers that were allowed to go in and alter the configuration of the systems. So I typically am looking at more of a 20 to 30 role scenario versus a 5 to 10.
Right.
But when you say that, just to break in, for what size system?
Medium to large.
Which would, in your terms, would mean?
Oh, a couple dozen controllers and probably 20 HMIs.
Okay.
Now that might be large.
I would point
to
out
you.
that no, a couple dozen controllers would adequately describe a water treatment plant where I used to work, but that's, the point I would make is how different are the pieces that are in there? I mean, if it's all the same stuff, you're going to see all the same people responding to it. In water systems, for example, everything's massively parallel. So it's the same doggone filter repeated 32 times. There's an east side, there's a west side, and there's all kinds of other interconnects and stuff, but that's the kind of process it is. It's just coagulants and filters and choices that they make, and then where do they, there's lots of planning that takes place and capacity issues, but it's all done by the same people because it's fundamentally a very simple process.
Well, yeah, I tend to look at it more from a multi-site company than a single-site company. So especially, we realize that there's always going to be uniqueness between the facility and the configuration of the controllers. But typically when we have multi-site companies, like an integrated oil and gas company, for instance, they would have corporate graphic standards. And those typically would be managed and administered centrally, where controller configurations is more of a local task. Because we know that all those plants physically aren't the same, though sometimes we would like to try. But we do want to have a common operating picture and a common framework around how the graphics and the human interacts with those infrastructure. So that's why I kind of like to separate those two.
Yeah, and if I was running a very large operation that had lots of different pieces, I would tend to do things that way, but there are lots of things out there that aren't like that.
And I think the other thing that you need to consider is how committed are you not just to the technology aspect of the roles, but the actual enforcement of the roles. Mm-hmm. You know, you'll see a lot of times, you know, oh, Steve needs to do this, put him in the admin role, and and now Carl needs to do it, and he's in the admin role, and then Joyce needs to do it, and you do an audit, you know, when you come in to do an assessment, and all the operators needed to be admins in the middle of the night, and were administrators. So there you've gone to all this work, added this complexity, and haven't gotten the benefit. So you have to really look organizationally, are you prepared to support this concept?
And a lot of that also boils down to certain infrastructure, like, for example, how well did you do your power systems for your controls? You know, if you have a problem with the power flickering and all your workstations suddenly go down and all your servers go down, well, then yeah, I can see why the operators suddenly got to be administrators, because let's be honest, the administrators didn't want to be woken up at night. But that's not really an issue there. That's an issue of how are you managing that background piece that caused this in the first place?
So I'll give you guys a chance just to make a closing comment, but I would say, you know, to the audience, from my standpoint, there's a lot of security controls out there, and some of the organizations probably here, some of you asset owners that have been doing programs for 5 or more years, you start to see, with the increasing amount of ICS security people and solutions, these layering and layering and layering on top of control, and none of them are, quote, bad, but you really need to start thinking, are we making the situation better or worse? A lot of them make it better, but you should at least introduce that, even if it's considered to be standard practice, you know, across other networks. Does it make sense in our network? What risks are we reducing? What risks are we introducing as we do that? Because, and I guess the last thing, to finish that, how much work are we going to have to spend to get the risk reduction that we're actually achieving with this new control? Because you have, as an asset owner, you have so many possible things you can do. You want to really pick the right ones, and you certainly don't want to make the situation worse. So, Joel, I'll let you.
Yeah, the way I look at this is I'm a big proponent in the frameworks like the NIST cybersecurity framework. And let's just break it down into the 3 big main categories: the prevent, the detect, and the correct and recover, right? The problem is, in general, most of us would agree that people tend to focus very heavily on the prevention aspect. And in operations, many of those controls are those that we would consider risky. The implementation of anything that blocks, stops, denies in a real-time operational environment can be very catastrophic if it's a false positive, which is why I really believe in doing a more balanced approach. And what you can't deliver through protection, you should at least attempt to address in detection and response. Because we've seen that, you know, with Equifax, it was just a matter of a few days between disclosure and patch, but they were able to take that very fine window and slide in. So even people that have fairly effective patch programs still are going to be susceptible. So the ability now is, if you can't prevent it, because it might impact operations, at least focus on detection and response if you should ever indicate that you have had a compromise or something leading to it.
My concern is that when we build security, we are making things so complicated or have so much overhead that the people involved say, you know what, this is starting to cost us too much. And they start looking at the old ways of doing the process. And there was a thread on SCADAsec about a couple months ago, if I remember correctly, about people reverting back to old analog computer systems, the analog PID controllers and things like that. And they were starting to ask each other, have we really lost our way? How much does this extra security stuff cost? And where do we get these people to manage it? And when we have a problem, who do we call? And how much do they cost us when they come in? And that's where a lot of these things get us into trouble, and we have to keep that in mind when we start pricing this stuff out, because that's what's driving this. They want their availability, they want their price, and they want their performance. Mm-hmm. And if we make the security overhead too high, guess what happens to security? And guess what happens to the process? We reduce the performance of the process too. Why? Because it just wasn't worth doing. That's the bottom line. So we have to be very sure that we don't make anything expensive, don't make it eat up too much people's time.
Okay, well, great. Thank you very much, Joel and Jake. Appreciate you being on the panel.